So my name is Mark Mattis. I'm a professor, or assistant professor of English in the University of Louisville's English department. I organize the American Afterlives stream. I'm an 18th centuryist by trade, but I've been on the organizing committee for some years at the LCLC, and I thought to myself, how can I make this work for me? But more importantly, I thought, you know, this has traditionally been a since 1900 conference. And at the same time, we've been busting apart all sorts of state chronologies about literary and cultural history. And it's high time that we put our, our money where our mouth is, and do that by crisscrossing chronologies, by bringing in a pre-1900 crowd who stands, of course, to illuminate and educate and dazzle traditional participants in the LCLC conference, but perhaps even more importantly, we have a lot to learn from the traditional attendees of this soiree. So we're excited to learn from you, to hear your questions, to rethink art and assumptions as early Americanists and 19th century Americanists. A little bit more context. This panel stream was inspired by recent works that rethink these chronologies by which we structure stories and studies of American literature, such as most notably Cody Mars and Christopher Hager's Timelines of American Literature. The LCLC then is beginning what we hope will be a new tradition, American Afterlives, a dedicated stream of panels that cross the pre-1900, post-1900 divide, considering how 20th and 21st century artists, communities, the residences of pre-1900 American cultures. We believe that the LCLC's traditional post-1900 focus presents a marvelous opportunity for scholars of earlier and later later periods to reach new audiences and share work that unsettles and or reconstructs our senses of American literary and cultural history. This past Monday, we held our first panel online, Transformations and Remediations. Today, we continue our conversation with two in-person panels centered on the topics of aesthetics now, and later, becoming and othering, with our virtual panelists from Transformations and Remediations joining us via Zoom. I'm now going to hand it over to our panel chair, Dr. David Anderson.
So I am, I see a name, so welcome. My name is David Anderson. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of English, University of Louisville. And first of all, I want to thank my colleague, Mark Mattis, for coming up with these panels and all of the hard work that he has put in what I think promises to be a tremendous opportunity to expand the conference and also to foster conversations between among a broader variety of scholars. And thank you for joining virtually, and thank you for being here. I'm going to now introduce all three panelists, and they will present in order according to the program. Our first presenter is Benjamin Johnson from the University of Central Missouri, who will be presenting Rethinking the Sublime for the 21st Century, Romanticism and Intertextuality in the Poetry of Diane, Seuss, and Tiana Clark. Benjamin Johnson is a professor of English at the University of Central Missouri, where he is the coordinator of the BA program in English. He was the lead editor of Beatrice Hastings on the life and work of a lost modern master, published by Gulf Coast in 2016, and his essays on modern literature have appeared in journals including Melis, Texas Studies in Literature and Language, and the Wallace Stevens Journal. Our second presenter, Joel Calahan, from the University of Chicago, a graduate from the University of Chicago, will be presenting Poems of Places, the legacy of Longfellow's global poetics in American modernism. Joel Calahan recently received his PhD in cutoff 2016.
Yeah.
Okay, 2016 from the University of Chicago, where he wrote a dissertation titled "What is the Language of Poetry? Diction, Dialect, and Speech in 19th Century Lyric," with Joshua Adams on our faculty and Michael Hansen. He co-edited a special issue of Modern Language Quarterly titled Reading Historical Poetics. He was an editor of the Chicago Review from 2010 to 2014, where he edited special issues on Elliott Carter, A.R. Ammons, and New Italian Writing. He now lives in San Diego, where he teaches secondary school students how to poetry and translates poetry and fiction from Italian. And finally, Eric Mabie from the University of Louisville will be presenting Leaves of Grass as Contemporary Artist book. Eric earned his BA in December 2022 from the University of Louisville's Creative Writing program, and he continues toward his MFA in Creative Writing at Spalding University here in Louisville. So without further ado, I introduce you to Benjamin Johnson.
All right. So, folks in the room, I've got a handout
Do you
here.
want me to take care of it?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Thank you. And then- All right. Well, that's spreading around. Basically, that handout is just a couple of the Diane Seuss poems I'll be talking about and a passage I'll be focusing on from Tiana Clark. In her 2005 essay, Foam, the poet Anne Carson makes two key points about the sublime. In one section, she argues that, quote, threat provides the sublime with its essential structure, an alternation of danger and salvation, which other aesthetic experiences, such as beauty, do not seem to share. Threat also furnishes the sublime with its necessary content, dire things, volcanoes, oceans, ecstasies, and dire reactions, death, dread, transport, within which the sublime soul is all but lost. In another section, Carson identifies the sublime as a, quote, documentary technique, end quote, and further argues that this technique can be identified in moments of what she calls spillage, which on the one hand has to do with quotations and reference, the spillage of ideas intertextually, but also the spilling of the intense sublime moment from writer to reader. Sublimity in Carson's conception thus spills quote by quote and from soul to soul. One of Carson's ideas, the first one, that the content and structure of the sublime is driven by ideas of threat, should feel relatively familiar to anyone who ever took a course on Romanticism. It fits pretty well with, for instance, Edmund Burke's concept of the sublime. The other idea, that the technique of the sublime requires intertextual and intersubjective spillage, is less expected. Certainly on a very naive level, we tend to think of the romantic sublime in terms of individuality and solitude. Yet Carson identifies the sublime with playful quotation and referential banditry. Her idea is both old and new. She, on the one hand, is hearkening back to the classical rhetorician Longinus, whose 3rd century book, which is sometimes translated On the Sublime, is in fact an assemblage of quotations with glosses. But Carson also evinces a poetic sensibility rooted in collage and pastiche that we typically identify more with modern and postmodern poetics. In essence, Carson is reaching back past Romanticism and the Enlightenment, all the way to Longinus, in order to imagine a 21st century version of a poetic sublime. So in this paper, I'm going to look at two poets who engage with the sublime by spilling out of, but also onto 19th century canonical texts. I don't want to reduce what they're doing to Carson's terminology. Like many poets before her, Carson's essays are most useful to understanding Carson herself. But I do think that the contemporary poets Diane Seuss and Tiana Clark both exemplify the intertextual century copying poetics that Carson describes as being essential to the sublime. Specifically, Seuss draws upon Keats, Dickinson, and Whitman to create poems that are somewhat cheeky, but still part of a romantic tradition. Clark, on the other hand, seems much more ambivalent about Romanticism, in particular the Romanticism of Wordsworth. And when her poem reaches its sublime conclusion, it does so with an air of resistance and even defiance of our assumptions about sublime poetics. Okay, so first of all, Seuss. Diane Seuss's 2021 collection, Frank Sonnets, which won the Pulitzer Prize actually for 2021, is a sequence of 128 14-line poems that cover a range of themes.
One recurring topic is the sublime, and this is particularly the case in several poems which either explicitly or implicitly reference 19th century or 18th and 19th century poetry. Aesthetically and intellectually, these poems perform the type of intellectual and affective spillage that Carson describes as the technique of the sublime. And, while I don't have time to break down the whole book, what I do want to do is look at a few moments where Seuss is particularly interested in Keats, Dickinson, and Whitman. She writes most directly about Keats in a poem in which she describes his death mask. But for me, her most compelling evocation of Keats occurs in the way that she repurposes two of his most famous images in the poem, We All Have Our Trauma Nadir, which is on the handout. The first 10 lines consider trauma as something unspeakable to others, but simultaneously too huge for private contemplation. There really is no place for it, she writes. Where do you find the urn large enough to hold the ashes of a pod of problematic blue whales? And even if you find that urn, where is the mantle strong enough to display it? This image is strange and upsetting. Thinking about the sheer size of an urn for a cremated blue whale pod as an objective correlative for trauma depends on imaginative expansion that is sublime in the sense that we see in, for instance, Zizek's description of the Kantian sublime as, quote, an object in which we experience the permanent failure of the representation to reach after the thing. So where Keats's well-wrought urn teaches us about beauty, Seuss's inconceivable urn overwhelms us with horror, and I would argue the sublime. And then in the last 4 lines, a songbird appears and is immediately followed by a description of someone bursting into the speaker's bedroom to attempt suicide. The pronoun he in line 12 is evocatively vague. Grammatically speaking, it seems to refer to the songbird, and indeed the idea of a songbird attempting to slash its own wrists is really incredibly ghastly and surreal. And might even be said to echo the trauma and horror of the Ovidian story of the nightingale's origins. That said, he could also refer to a human male, and indeed Seuss's sequence as a whole is full of various men in crisis, including her own son, a friend of hers who dies of AIDS, and also Frank O'Hara, who the book is effectively named after. In any event, Keats ends his most famous songbird poem wondering whether he wakes or sleeps as the music of the bird fades into nature, whereas Seuss throws us into a waking nightmare, waiting for the sound of an ambulance. Emily Dickinson is another frequent point of reference in Seuss's sonnets, though these poems tend to be a little lighter, or at least funnier. Seuss's I Fell in Love with Death, for instance, follows Dickinson in personifying death as a suitor of sorts, though in Seuss's case, this lover is, quote, kinky, but in the most earnest, heartfelt way. He sucked my fingers while I read him Peter Pan, itself a children's book about dead children. A more significant poem to my mind, and this one's on your handout, is The Emergent Self is Not a Self That Loves, a poem that follows Dickinson by way of Kant, or perhaps Kant by way of Dickinson, into a consideration of the sublime as something so fundamentally internal that ultimately the self is the most sublime thing of all. Seuss begins the poem by describing love, but love, she says, is shallow, and there is something beneath the shallows and something beneath that. This subterranean something, she insists, is not ennui, but sublimity. The self, she suggests, contains a basement of an infinite underworld museum where in secret death and the sublime bash against each other as clouds bash during storms or theories bash in rooms full of theoreticians. In the 2 previous poems I looked at, Seuss tends to be a bit cheeky in her rendition of the sublime, but these lines are unrestrainedly romantic, in the same way that Dickinson is in The Brain is Wider Than the Sky. Indeed, like Dickinson, Seuss moves from the depths of interiority to a gaze at the sky in an offhand calculation of the mathematical sublime. Love is smaller than the sky is smaller than the self. Dickinson famously goes even farther than this, declaring that, quote, the brain is just the weight of God, right in that last stanza. So if there's a difference in Seuss's approach, perhaps it's simply that she runs her equation through fewer iterations. But by locating sublimity simultaneously in the subconscious basement and the high-blown spectral sky, Seuss is quintessentially romantic, resembling James Twitchell's argument that romantic poets and painters conceived of the sublime that something could be signaled through movement both up and out to the horizon and down and into the unconscious. It goes both ways at once. Anyway, so if Carson is correct that the sublime is characterized by spillage across boundaries and between subjectivities, then the last poem of her sonnet sequence, which I'll just reference briefly, might be the most sublime. The poem concludes, sort of in its last few lines, imagining this transitive spillage of kisses across a history of lips. For instance, I happily kiss lips that kiss Basquiat's lips. She writes in one line. There are similar games played with O'Hara and Whitman. And then, like Whitman, she sort of imagines herself into the future in the last line of the book, where she writes, she wonders whether someday someone will brag that, quote, I kissed someone who kissed someone who kissed someone who kissed her. So instead of thinking of the poetic history of the sublime in terms of Oedipal battles, Seuss and Carson invite us to imagine it as an intimacy that spills across time between writers and also across genders and sexualities. This network of affection and the almost giddy attempt to imagine it becomes its own sublime object of contemplation and allows Seuss's very unusual and death-haunted sonnet sequence to end by making the English sonnet's most venerable claim that art and love can live beyond death. Switching over to Clark. Tiana Clark's 2018 The Rime of Nina Simone is a 17-page narrative poem that does exactly what the title suggests. It reimagines Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner as a conversation with the singer and songwriter Nina Simone. Clark directly discusses romantic ideas about the sublime throughout the poem, most notably that of Wordsworth. But her imagined conversation with Simone leads her to the conclusion that the romantic conception of sublimity is a complicated and sometimes perhaps irresponsible stance, perhaps for any poet, but certainly for an African-American poet. The poem also works through a technique of intertextual spillage, but overall it's more combative, explosive, and outward-looking than some of the romantic models it evokes. So the speaker of the poem is an African-American creative writing graduate student who is on her way to a workshop when Nina Simone, back from the dead, stops her and says, I need to tell you something about yourself. Though Clark's poem is quite a bit different stylistically than Coleridge's, most notably it's in free verse rather than ballad stanzas, it shares with Coleridge's poem a basic narrative structure in which a young person is interrupted on the way to a social ritual by an otherworldly figure who communicates some secret knowledge. Clark also winks to Coleridge in a variety of smaller ways throughout the poem. Simone describes gospel music. It blew my sails southward. She describes her touring career as her moving around the country like a ghost ship. She describes her husband as an albatross. Similarly, like Coleridge frequently talks about the Ancient Mariner's skinny hands, and Clark describes Simone's fingers throughout the poem. They are pirouetting fingers, diaphanous fingers. It's tempting to go on pointing out the various Coleridgean Easter eggs Clark spreads around the poem, but I worry that doing so would imply that the poem's main interest is in its cleverness. But I don't really think that's the case. The poem has many expansively sublime passages, which strikes me less as an allusion to Coleridge than an elaboration upon the ways that the Ancient Mariner mingles grandeur and horror. Take, for instance, the speaker's initial description of Simone, time-worn but regal, her spine made of satin and salt, her bolted back clutching every battle-born ballad, a lone column of glissandos and thunder snow, booming and bright. Similarly sublime is Simone's account of how she felt when performing, quote, felt glacial depths, wet and coffinless, transatlantic moan, simmer and hiss, beautiful sharks inside me, water boiled into black mist, cumulus clouding into songs of resistance, hovering above the slaver's pitching slippery deck. Taken on their own, these passages feel quite romantic, and I think can also be read as being of a piece with other modern American poems, where specifically the image of a singing woman is used to signify experiences of transport or rapt attention. I'm thinking like the Idea Porter at Key West, or Sterling Brown's Ma Rainey, The Day Lady Died. But as Clark's poem pushes toward its conclusion, its relationship to Romanticism, and for that matter, the idea of, quote, transport, is incredibly vexed, not least because the term transport means something very different in the context of the transatlantic slave trade that the poem references on several occasions. Two of the key threads of the poem, the imagined conversation between the speaker and Simone about representing suffering in art, and Clark's self-awareness of canonical Romanticism, intertwine in a key moment about 2/3 of the way through the poem, and this is the bit that's on the handout. After Simone challenges the speaker to justify writing, quote, black hurt, black scars into poems she presents to predominantly white workshop audience, the speaker replies by saying that amidst the poplars and magnolias, she sees and hears, quote, bloated faces, these beauteous forms, still swinging, limp pendulum, waxy beach white blooms, egg white inside hard-boiled eyes. Here, Clark imagines an impressionistic account of a lynching, but mingles in it a series of lines from Tintern Abbey, in which Wordsworth describes using his memory of nature as a way to lighten, quote, the heavy and weary weight of all this unintelligible world, in order to achieve a meditative state, which in the final line of that stanza of Tintern Abbey is where he says that he can, quote, see into the life of things. Clark here uses collage to create incongruity and irony. Obviously, Wordsworth's lines seem incongruous to lynching imagery, but Wordsworth also feels out of place next to Simone's music, most notably the song Mississippi Goddamn, which was partially inspired by the 1963 Birmingham, Alabama church bombing that killed the 4 little girls Clark mentions a few lines earlier. Clark suggests that the Wordsworthian Sublime, with its focus on emotion recollected in tranquility, that allows the poet to see into the life of things, comes from a place of privilege that is perhaps not always available to contemporary African-American artists who are perhaps forced at times to look into the depth of things. Consider, for instance, that Clark quotes Wordsworth saying that in hours of weariness, he is able to feel sensations sweet, whereas Simone in Mississippi Goddamn sings in the first 2 lines that racist violence throughout the South, quote, has made me lose my rest. I don't think, though, that Clark is simply rejecting Romanticism. True, she suggests strongly that, you know, a rather cartoonish version of a Wordsworthian retreat from the world, and I'm aware that just boiling Wordsworth down to that stanza is an incredibly unfair representation of Wordsworth and his politics. Does not strike her as always being a viable poetic option. But sublimity as a means to register horror, shock, or the scale of historical atrocity is an essential part of her poem that bears some similarity to Coleridge's mingling of sublimity and horror. Near the end of Clark's poem, the speaker says to Simone that she feels an urgent need to tell her workshop that, quote, my body is real and you cannot write around me. And when Simone asks her what her compulsion is, she writes, the slave ship, war machine, Robert Hayden's Jesus, Savior, pilot, me. Those lines are quoted from Hayden's Middle Passage, which also uses collage and fragmentation to meditate on the horrors of history. And this suggests one viable approach to sublime poetics, that intertextuality. And I think that then Simone, talking to Clark, suggests another, and this is the last little bit here. When she says, Simone in the poem says to the speaker, baby, you can't put a fire out or fold a flood. Didn't Emily D say that? Didn't you learn? A thing that can ignite can go itself without a fan upon the slowest night. Here, Clark imagines Nina Simone effectively covering Dickinson's poem 530, You Cannot Put a Fire Out, right? I mean, there are specific lines from the poem that she's also like baby is not in Dickinson. Anyway, I would argue that, you know, she's also suggesting what she finds most useful in Romanticism. There is a sense of the grand power of nature in Dickinson's poem, right? Fires and floods can be untamable. But there's also a suggestion that these powers can be internal as well. That unquenchable fire certainly could be internal. And note that Dickinson's reason for why you can't fold a flood and put it in your drawer is because, quoting Dickinson, the winds would find it out and tell your cedar floor. Which is to say, actually, you can fold a flood and put it in a drawer. Or at least you can if you're capable of getting a flood onto a piece of paper, though you should be aware that the consequences might be dire if the flood comes spilling out. But being willing to step into one's internal fire or to get the flood onto the page, consequences be damned, is exactly where Clark ends her poem. When, after concluding her conversation with Simone, the speaker writes, quote, "I walk to class, my spine a grounded stake, lit with liquid brass and burning peaches, bewitched, ready to flame, I enter the room, bursting."
I'd like to begin my talk today with two passages. The first comes from a eulogy written for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in April 1882 by his contemporary Walt Whitman. The eulogy is long and full of sincere as well as backhanded compliments. Whitman calls Longfellow poet of the mellow twilight of the past, poet of all sympathetic gentleness, universal poet of women and young people. In a particularly damning passage, he says, "He strikes a splendid average and does not sing exceptional passions or humanity's jagged escapades. He's not revolutionary, brings nothing offensive or new, does not deal hard blows." Yet in the end of the eulogy, and that's what I'm putting on the screen here, Whitman is generous about Longfellow's lack of special originality, as he says, in his imitation and translation work. To which he basically says, "Good, we need more of this." And I quote the key part, "Ere the new world can be worthily original and announce herself for her own heroes, she must be well saturated with the originality of others." My second quote is far less judicious, and it comes from Ezra Pound, writing about 45 years later in the spirit of romance. In a commentary on the Portuguese poet Camões, Pound performs, I guess, a casual bloodletting of Longfellow in the entire Victorian age of verse. And here's the key part towards the end. "Marooned on a stern and rock-bound coast, planted in an uninteresting milieu and in a dreary age, Camões would have shown a corresponding mediocrity. If in the future anyone should ever become interested in the mid-18th century atmosphere of Massachusetts, he would find the works of Longfellow most valuable as archaeological documents." And there you have it, Longfellow as an archaeological document of a dreary age, a damning pronouncement that will be echoed by many of Pound's contemporaries and seal Longfellow's tomb for decades to come. I start with these two judgments because despite their similarities, I'm curious about how the second judgment became the common wisdom. Whitman's intuition about Longfellow's achievement, his fluency, his erudition, melody, and ultimately the salutary popularity of his verse is nonetheless a position that has come charging back into the critical conversation. Scholars of transatlantic cultural studies like Leslie Eckel, Patricia Roylance, and Simon Elliott renewed interest in thinking about Longfellow's popularity in England and Europe and its reflection on the global print culture and tastes of the 19th century reading public. These scholars are reckoning with, in the words of Eckel, Longfellow's cosmopolitan pedagogy as a vital part of his poetry career. More importantly, critics like Kirsty Blair and other historians of working class verse in Victorian England have come to understand what fellow poets and critics have long considered Longfellow's defects, simplicity, lack of originality, stereotyping, as the very central features of his popular appeal. I'll come back to this idea in a bit. Following the lead of these critics, it's my contention that Longfellow's verse style makes him particularly interesting and influential as a translator of poetry. Longfellow's translation output is enormous and pretty much ignored in the scholarship. Longfellow read and translated poems from an impressive 12 languages. He wrote textbooks in French and Italian for his modern language students at Bowdoin and then Harvard, and edited thick volumes of historical scholarship in European languages, as well as translation anthologies covering the entire globe. Translation was for Longfellow a special form of aesthetic inspiration, by which the feelings of a reader might be engaged and activated through the voice of the translator to the feelings of a poet at a particular time and place. This is, I believe, a practice of translation which was ignored and then discarded, along with his entire body of work, by the theorists and practitioners of translation in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, especially Pound. It is ironic and should be damning of Pound that the reading public would have first heard of Kenways, who Pound praises, in English in one of Longfellow's own translation anthologies, Poets and Poetry of Europe. In the next little while, I hope to present for your persuasion an account of Longfellow's significance by offering an overview of his translation anthologies, especially his late series of Poems and Places. Ultimately, my argument is this: Longfellow's legacy as a translator is critical in the history of American literature, a history that has given far too much importance to Pound and the modernists. Instead, Longfellow conserves a sensibility closer to Romanticism that lived on well into the 20th century, using translation as a method of fellow feeling, something like literary sympathy or literary collaboration, that might ultimately prove to be a clear lineage in the history of lyric poetry tradition from the 19th century to now. There's Poems and Places. Poems and Places, published decades at the end of Longfellow's life, is his magnum opus in global poetics, comprising 31 volumes organized by nation, and within each volume geographically by city, town, and place of interest. The collection gathered many poems of place by American and English, and also reused many poems in translation from his earlier collection, Poetry, Poets of Europe, from 1845. However, in this non-scholarly reader's edition, they take on a different character. As Longfellow writes in a journal entry from May 1874, the anthology serves as a kind of poetic guidebook, alluding in a faddish kind of way to the reader as a kind of genteel literary tourist gallivanting around the countryside with a Baedeker under his arm. He writes in the preface to the volume on the subject of poetry and travel. In these comments, Longfellow seems to want to find a balance between tourism and something deeper. At the end, he uses the word consecrated. I confess these poems have an indescribable charm, as shown how the affections of men have gone forth to their favorite haunts and consecrated them forever. It's striking, that term. It's not a term of the casual traveler looking for sites of interest, but perhaps of the pilgrim on a journey to a holy site that treats the poet as a guide of some kind of spiritual aesthetic experience. A sample of the table of contents confirms this suggestion. The collection begins in familiar territory in England, and I'm showing volume 2 here. The first 4 or 5 volumes are all England, and then branches into Scotland and Wales. It has many familiar names on here, a kind of literary star tour. We've got Burns and Shakespeare and Wordsworth, all of the Romantics. And then when we move abroad into Europe, we still have many familiar English names: Milton, Addison, Byron, and then later when we get to northern Italy, we have Shelley and Southey, we have Coleridge and Wordsworth in Germany. If we take Longfellow's plan at face value here, a kind of poetic guidebook, we have a sense of the curatorial aims of this volume. Sympathetic minds from near and far in their native languages fix the beauty and emotion particular to places, which may be famous or totally unknown outside the poem. So if you look on the right there, we have Robert Browning, in his verse retelling of the Piper folk tale, identifies Hamlin as a place. George Canning, fairly unknown, his song is like a college cheer for the University of Göttingen, where he would his alma mater. And we also have it against Heine's reflections on Goethe's monument. Both of those places fix Frankfurt for the person who's never been there, right? Longfellow's genteel reader. In Rome, on the left here, the canonical Latin authors like Virgil and Lucan precede Renaissance masters like Castiglione and Quevedo, alongside modern amateurs that Longfellow knew, like T.W. Parsons, who was a dentist who visited Rome in the 1830s and they began publishing translations of Dante. We could go on and on. And there are so many tables of contents in these 31 volumes that are quite fascinating. The last volume is Oceanica, and it has Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and it has all these poems of seafaring and travel, and poems of the Arctic, right? But I think you get the project. The poet guiding the reader through a kind of spiritual journey through typical landscapes, towns, and cities. Now, I want to talk about this word type for a moment, or typical. Longfellow's reliance on character types and place types has long been held in contempt, both by contemporaries and modern critics. Virginia Jackson, in her essay on Longfellow's Hiawatha, argues that the poem uses the type of the Native American, Hiawatha, and the oversimplified fiction of his pictorial language to create a fantasy that the poem's white middle-class reader could read a native language through the prosthesis of an imported European meter. The same could be said of the landscape and town types, as well as the character types that appear in the poems, peasant, priest, poet, that populate poems and places. These spaces are fantasies of the poet's imagination, presented through received forms and types, the guidebook, as sites of interest to the traveler who's stuck at home. In Jackson's words, Longfellow's types are manipulative, a poetic ruse, she says. She echoes the more general critique of the travel guide made in Roland Barthes' mythologies, which in their skimming across the surface of places and peoples indulge in what he calls the disease of essence. Other critics, though, have helpfully pushed back against this reductive critique, I think, of Longfellow's fictions, that they're mere manipulation. Kirsty Blair, in a recent essay on Longfellow's poem Excelsior as a source of inspirational verse for British working-class unions, writes that the core characteristic of inspirational verse is that it aims to sound familiar and unoriginal. Both in terms of content and form, it deliberately eschews individuality, specificity, and innovation. The types put into play in these poems are indeed derivative or easy, but I would argue in Longfellow should also be read as that which makes the work appealing beyond the page. They provide its memorability, its adaptability. And yes, of course, it's confirmation of what the reader already thinks that he or she knows about a place. Longfellow, as an educator, after all, meeting his readers where they enter instruction. We can keep this analysis of Blair's in mind if we zoom in a little closer to a particular location, and I chose this one, at Harz Mountains, a forested highland in northern Germany that has both social and literary significance as the site of some of the first world conservation areas to protect against deforestation, mining, and animal slaughter, as well as, not coincidentally for Longfellow, the site of a young Goethe's first ecstatic reflections on the natural sciences. These poems around the Harz illustrate the dramatic effect of gathering a chorus of lyric voices from the same region in the same poetic lineage. Their tone and angle change dramatically in their different voices, from Goethe's dizzying heights of imagination, from selections from Faust, and from the Ride to the Harz in Winter, to Coleridge's quiet homesick view from afar in the direction of England to the north, to Freiladrott's narrative mythologizing about a young hunter in pursuit of a stag, and then finally on to Matthew Arnold's metapoetic reflection on Heine and Goethe's presence in the landscape that he's viewing. These are not pristine, open wilds that Longfellow is taking his readers to. He's guiding us through a well-traveled circuit of poets. Like the local town administrator of Kidlenberg nearby, who first protected the rock formations called the Teufelsmauer, the Devil's Wall, in 1852. Longfellow is encircling this landscape of poetic fences to preserve it. He gathers voices from near and far praising the place, different styles of verse, different genres, narrative, lyric, ode. This is what Blair might refer to as the poetic function of inspiration. These poets were all inspired by other poets who were inspired to write, and now their inspiration will inspire the reader. If we turn to Longfellow's own verse translations, we can find more compelling evidence of what I'm calling his translation as inspiration. We move to the nearby village of Ilmenau. This is a translation that Longfellow did not publish elsewhere, saving it for this volume. The poem relies on an archetype. No other German lyric poem, as the second Wanderer's Night Song, is so connected to a particular spot, this particular mountain cabin, which is now a historical landmark because the poem was written in it. Nor is it so perfectly suited to evoke that specific place. Longfellow's translation, here on the left, draws us toward Goethe's structure and tone by matching the rhyme scheme and line length of the original, even including the internal accents. Vogel and Schweigen, asleep in trees, but he lengthens them with long O sounds and E sounds. With the two poems, the poets are as travelers who have stopped for rest at the same mountain cabin decades apart. Longfellow finding Goethe's name scratched into the cabin wall and feeling the thrill of connection to another human across time in the same space. Longfellow's translations of Santa Teresa of Avila and his translation of a sonnet of Vincenzo da Filicaia in the volume on Italy both illustrate this wide-ranging imitation. They use a diction imitative of religious and patriotic verse to reinforce in the receptive reader the feelings associated from nostalgia for these simplistic genres. Their sincerity in this imitative mode is precisely meant to be their purpose as translation. So this is a poem that he titled Santa Teresa's Bookmark, which is handwritten on a bookmark that Teresa kept in her room. And it's a fairly literal rendering of the tone of quiet self-inspiration suffusing the original. Teresa's poem is a prayer, and its placement on a bookmark suggests it also serves as inspiration for meditation. Longfellow's choices of a biblical register of the obsolete third person singular verb inflection, right, F, throughout the whole poem, and the syntactic inversions map the verse onto the syntax of the original with the verb at the end of the line. But the effect is to draw the reader into a meditative emotion, reading the poem as a prayer in English. It has that King James feel to it. The Filicaia sonnet is a Petrarchan sonnet written in praise of a unified Italy in 1762, about 100 years before unification was complete. It presents an energetic and forceful defense of Italian beauty and pride by ruing that its desirability has made it a target for military conquest and occupation from the north. The sonnet poses a series of complex and conflicting emotions: beauty, suffering, beauty, strength, fear, love, waste away, or challenge. Right? And Longfellow managed to stir something close to it with the surprising diction in the formal strictness of the sonnet. See the second line where he writes fatal gift, or infelice, which means unfortunate in Italian, playing on the etymological root of fate, right? Fatal. Or see the bizarre third line, the dour funest, a really archaic phrasing, which is which he uses to translate funeste dote. It's a kind of a cognate translation that evokes the bridesmaid imagery of the original. There was the light touch too at the end where he captures the alliteration in the final line. But step back and think about what he's doing by translating and publishing this in 1877, right after unification. Longfellow's translation arrives right after the Kingdom of Italy is unified with the capture of Rome in 1871. As a poem of place, the translation captures a presentness between then and now, between Filicaia's old yearning and the new celebration of a unified Italy. I'll summarize some of these features I've been teasing out of the examples. If we were to call Longfellow's influence a translation of inspiration, what we might mean is a translation practice that sought sympathy between the traveler and the local who shared views of a place together. Between then and now, where a continuous present is shared by a poet with those who visited the place before, even in ancient times. A sympathy between form and feeling, where the poem's emotion comes attached to a received form. And a sympathy between word and action, where words are chosen to inspire memorization and then action, physical action. Now I'm turning outward, and this is my final section. Literary historians have all but ignored Longfellow's contributions to the history of translation English, and it's worth asking why. The overall scholarly dismissal of his body of work in favor of his contemporaries, Whitman and Emerson, bears on the question that there's more to it. Scholars of translation studies, on the other hand, seem to overlook Longfellow because he's not a theorist of translation, just a translator. But a fact not to underestimate is the foundational importance of modernism in the field of translation studies, and in particular, a recurrent obsession with a modernist theory of translation that continues to the present. If Longfellow promoted translation as inspiration, then call this theory translation as criticism in the language of the modernists, or if we're to follow the language of the critical discourse that founded translation studies in the 1970s, translation as critique. This story begins and ends with two key figures, Walter Benjamin and Ezra Pound. Benjamin's essay on the task of a translator advances an idealist theory of language based on the discernment of a work's translatability in Harry Stone's well-known rendering of the German term, Übersetzbarkeit. But what is this translatability for Benjamin? It's a quality of a literary work that calls for translation and gets that translation. It's an organically comparative act, Benjamin continues, expressing the central reciprocal relationship between languages far more profoundly and clearly than in the more mere act of comparative reading. Rendering the kinship of languages visible is not incidental to the act of translation for Benjamin, but rather its very purpose. Literary criticism remains on the surface of literature because it is descriptive of language. Translation as criticism penetrates the surface by defining just where and how the kinship between languages is established. A completed translation finally transplants the original into a more definitive linguistic realm. Realizing the translation forecloses the work's translatability as a potential to be rendered into any language. Benjamin's argument suggests the translation of the text serves a critical function in the life of that text by revealing organically its essential aesthetic or literary features. The translator discloses a poem's enmeshment in its native language and tradition by the critical act of displacing it out of that language and tradition. Pound's own translation practice, as many critics have shown, forms the ground of his radical poetic manifestos and experiments in criticism and anthologies. In Pound's telling, the aesthetic and poetic qualities of a body of work, whether the lyric quietude of Ribot, the philosophical clarity of Guido Cavalcanti, the lyrical energy of Bertrand de Born, remain as glimmering touchstones of culture that might draw a modern mind to a clarity and beauty that belong to a time and place where these qualities lived. I'm voicing Pound here, but not quoting him. As Pound writes in his philological notes on his translations of Cavalcanti, the Stil Novo poets belong to a world foreign to modern sensibility. We appear to have lost the radiant world where one thought cuts through another with clean edge, a world of moving energies, he writes. In translation, then, the poet brings us to that world, though imperfectly, hoping only, he says, as he writes of his own translation, to drive the reader's perception further into the original than it would have without them penetrated. Or in short, as he says in this essay called Guido's Relations, the translator can show where the treasure lies. Translation is thus a practice of selection that hones the aesthetic essence of an original. Translation as delineation, as boundary making to set a critical standard by which other examples might be judged. This approach to translation has had impressive staying power in translation studies. Major works of the past few decades, such as Lawrence Venuti's The Translator's Invisibility, Steiner's After Babel, Emily Abder's Translation Zone, and Hans Saucy's Translation and Citation, all in some way return to the deep well of this modernist approach. Like Pound, they value the metacritical self-conscious translation that delineates position and therefore lays bare a social, political, or aesthetic critique through the act of translation. Venuti, in particular, with his suspicion of the fluency of a translation, seems particularly guilty of this critical bias in favor of a translation that performs a kind of ideology critique in the movement into a new language. Where Longfellow's work might now provide a vital historical and aesthetic touchstone is in the work of poet translators who came after. In the return of poets like Langston Hughes, Edward Dorn, Jack Spicer, Elizabeth Bishop, and Robert Lowell, to a translation practice of synthetic collaboration. If we can brace ourselves against our received reaction to Longfellow's sentimentality, to his simplicity, to his sloganing and character typing, we might find more continuity than contempt for Longfellow's translations in the longer history of American poetry. This is a kind of speculative ending, my own moment where I want you all to go out and think for yourselves about where you might see this. And without time or space to go into examples, it's suggested to be that for example, inspirational translations of Edward Dorn and Gordon Brotherston of political verse by Latin American guerrilla poets, or the Av dialect translations of Cuban poet activist Nicolas Guillen by Langston Hughes, just to name a few, might have their precursor in Longfellow's practice of translation as inspiration. He also figures, as I would suggest, as a key background figure in the globalist poetics of the new American poetry, where Rilke, Garcia Lorca, and Montale, figures translated, impersonated, and held in esteem, precisely for their shared philosophical sentimentality, opened up new worlds for poetry. It's the generative rather than the critical capacity that has lived on, I would argue. Okay? As Longfellow wrote in a letter to the German poet Ferdinand Farligrath, translation is like running a plowshare through the soil of one's mind. 1,000 germs of thought start up, which otherwise might have lain and rotted in. Thanks.
We're ready to begin real quick. My name is Eric Mabie. Thank you for having me here today. This paper here is about Walt Whitman and Warren Emmerich, celebrating Walt Whitman. Quick disclaimer, I'm not a in-depth scholar of Walt Whitman, so if there's any questions or anything like that afterwards, please, this is an invitation. Okay, so to start off with, Emmerich published her book in celebration of Walt Whitman's 200th birthday. This paper examines Emmerich's craft as interpretive decisions involving a range of material and linguistic components rooted in Whitman's own books. These include features such as Whitman's daguerreotype portrait in the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass and 19th century typesetting choices. In addition, Emmerich incorporates quotations from Whitman's poetry. In this paper, I examine changes to the poems that Emmerich employs, poems which Whitman himself revised over 6 editions of Leaves of Grass, beginning with a brief publishing history of Whitman's book, as well as some conceptual observations by working book artists. I then, drawing upon the material and linguistic elements of Emmerich's book, as well as historical context of Whitman's own book work, I consider the ways in which Emmerich's craft, to quote the artist statement, explores the ideas central to Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, including transcendentalism and inherent goodness of nature and realism, depicting familiar things as they are. By invoking Whitman's essential metaphors and themes, including the interrelation of the one and the many, and the cyclic relation of life and death. Walt Whitman published his first edition of Leaves of Grass anonymously. In 1855, he did give himself away to readers in an unorthodox introduction in 2 ways. The first was with a daguerreotype portrait of himself without a caption. The second was by calling out his own name in an untitled poem known as The Song of Myself. The third introduction by the author can be found in the copyright statement, which states the book was entered by Walt Whitman in the clerk's office in the District Court of the United States, Southern District, New York. You see that in the Walt Whitman archive. Walt Whitman released 5 major editions throughout his life, changing poems along and adding and taking away others. There's a 7th Deathbed edition that is not usually mentioned since it is nearly identical to the 6th edition. Whitman's first 3 editions bear traces of Whitman's own intimate knowledge of printing and book culture since childhood. As Henry observes in her article, The Design and Topography of Leaves of Grass, 1860, at age 12, he had apprenticed under the printer William Harsford. This training has profoundly informed Whitman's strong hand in the design of the 1855 and 1856 editions, as scholars such as Ed Folsom and Ed Whitley have observed. Even Whitman's relatively mass-produced 1860 edition, which according to Barbara Henry has received first-class treatment from a real publisher, Dale Leverage, was very much in the material product of Whitman's oversight. The 456-page Leaves of Grass edition published by Thayer and Eldridge in 1860 was set and typed by hand under Whitman's direct supervision at the Boston Type Foundry. So this slide, we see some Emmerich's design features in their artist book. Although readers of Whitman may be familiar with the poet's own artistic endeavors involving the print publication of his books, matters which I discussed in portions of this talk, Whitman's editions of Leaves of Grass are nonetheless bound up in the traditional codex format. Warren Emmerich's own book works strategically draws upon the codex format as both a matter of craft and a matter of reader expectation when encountering Whitman's poetry. As the book artist Anna Gorsuch observes, the thing that we picture when someone says book is an idea as much as an object. Emmerich's Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman is an engaging example of the artist's book that employs conceptualizations of the book as an interpretive method. Emmerich plays with the expectations of the codex form, incorporating some elements from Whitman's codices while simultaneously incorporating a more diverse range of paper structures and binding techniques. In this way, Emmerich celebrates Whitman's by transforming or remediating his books in both linguistic and material levels. One way in which Emmerich's Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman encompasses elements from each edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass is through the subtle conversation across Whitman's bindings and her own. At first glance, Emmerich appears to be a high-cover codex, bound in lush green cloth and stapled with a pale green lettering on both front and the spine. Finally, Emmerich includes a copy of Walt Whitman's signature along with the name of her imprint, abstract orange, and the location of publication date. This choice recalls Whitman's signature on the 6th edition, 1881 to 1882 cloth cover. That's from the Whitman Archives. Okay, so this slide right here, before I continue on, you're going to see that I've got each editions here. Cover 1 and cover 2 for 1867, there's actually a third cover book. I did not find the actual cover for that. And also, I didn't show the deathbed edition on here, but that's a little bit more of a tribute thing. And you'll see that a little bit later, especially if you take a look at 1867 cover number 2. The pages between the covers of the text block are in the same pale green as the lettering, perhaps imitating the standard pale paper found in most mass-produced codices. Closer inspection reveals that the board's cloth texture is rough, the texture stapling, and the colors of the binding aesthetic of Whitman's 1855 and 1856 editions, which feature green cover and ornate leafy text features. Especially in the 1855 edition, the symbolism is variegated colors and textures and bindings place both Whitman's book and Emmerich's objects of thematic conversation with Whitman's set with metaphor to the Leaves of Grass, articulating the relationship between the one and the many. Emmerich's incorporation of visual and material cues from Whitman's books also speaks to the poet's preoccupation with cycles of life and death. Emmerich takes such cycles to heart, developing an art object that, as the book artist Keith Smith writes, calls attention to the experience and the format cycle which does not have a concept of a beginning or end. And that's Rosenberg. Emmerich's binding, for example, is not pristine. It is worn spots on the lettering and the cover, indicating an aging process of the life cycle as much as the historical age of the historical books from which Emmerich draws. The contrast of rich and pale green suggests the different stages of continuous life cycle, both organic and bookish. Now, the pale green is very similar to those used found in Whitman's 1855 and 1856 editions. Even the letter forms themselves evoke a life cycle of Whitman's book across many editions. For example, the title style in Emmerich's cover celebrates Whitman's 1856, 1867, and 1871 editions. She bridges them by using a pale green color and lowercase letters from the 1856, the italicized of, and the 1871. The word placement from all 3 editions, Emmerich ends her title of a period like 1867 and 1871 editions.
Eric, can I ask you to speak just a little bit louder so that our virtual listeners can hear you a little bit clearer?
Yeah, I was worried about that.
That's okay. This was Rogue Zoom. Thank you.
Okay. Emmerich's evocation of cycles through adopting and adapting features of Whitman's books continues in the opening of her book. Instead of an interior text block composed of sewn together signatures, we find a clamshell case that lay flat. Nor is the inside of the front cover of the case in the expected paste down of the mass-produced codex volume. Rather, we encounter the derogatory portrait of Whitman himself in the quote, "All seems beautiful to me." Whitman famously used this portrait as a frontispiece to the 1855 first edition of Leaves of Grass, as well as a smaller version of the 1856 edition. Use of the portrait was an innovative invitation to readers to know their author as a person rather than just a name in front of the book. Many readers of the first edition may not have known that this was their author at the time, but the popularity of Leaves of Grass would eventually fix the author's identity to the portrait. In doing so, situate his reader in a unusually intimate relation with himself. Indeed, as Brian Folker notes, his gaze directly engages the viewer in a manner in which Whitman apparently worried to be too confrontational for this purpose. Photography was a relatively new art form, and Whitman developed a fascination but the future possibilities for cementing social ties when compared to other visual media. Much like the poetic Whitman's ambition for his art, Whitman's portrait himself styled in the everyman's appearance of a man's labor's clothes and imperial name instead of his name. Seeing a social leveling of the writer and the reader, suggesting his focal rights, photography is the harbinger of a new democratic art, excuse me. The art and the politic of Emerson's use of Whitman's portrait celebrates in her own book, A Cycle Unbroken. The political aesthetic of the frontispiece dovetails with the quotation, all seems beautiful to me. Emerson draws upon this line of Whitman's poem, Poem of the Road, which first appeared in the second edition of 1856, Leaves of Grass. The complete stanza reads, all seems beautiful to me. I can repeat over to men and women, you have done such good with it. I would do the same to you. Emerson may have chosen this line because it reads like the coming together of one and all, a calling to celebrate and enjoy each other as they are without shame. Goodwill towards those that the speakers met during his travels on the road and a pledge to repay their kindness. The full poem is a call to adventure with the speaker acknowledging their own burdens as they look towards meeting everyone and indeed sharing their common experiences in common cause. Emerson's choices highlights the length and breadth of how Williams's first edition, Leaves of Grass, has traveled since 1855. With this poem first appearing in the second edition, then a significantly revised for the 1867 fourth edition, Song of the Open Road, and of course making this way over time in the space in Emerson's own book. The traverse of space and time, spaces in the books and sometimes their publication, and the artists and the readers that they connect, is further elaborated in the front section with the inclusion of Walt Whitman's date of birth, May 31st, 1819, as well as the birth information of Emerson's own work, namely the title, publisher, and author information, and so forth. Now, as you see across on this slide right here, we've got all the editions, all the different covers, and as this thing opens up, please take note of the center field there and how that matches up that way. Have a little bit of a, the way the colors go, the cycle of life as it starts and keeps going back and forth. Doesn't end. All of this prefatory matter leads readers to the cloth in the orange tab and the opening of the second cover of sorts. Readers are taken aback when they discover the interior of a pale green box. The box is at the center of the field, filled with horizontal rows of leaves of grass, colored in a rotating color scheme of different shades of green, rising across a range of heights, occupying in the same space within the book. This is a hypnotic representation of a continuous cycle, no beginning and no end. Each blade of grass blends into the next and stands out as something different. The points are both in unison and out of sync with each other. Readers, viewers who may look at these individually or as a group, there are 31 rows consisting of 15 to 20 blades each. Viewers can even find the one blade without a sharp tip, perhaps as a design choice representative of the one, in which case Emerson, who, like Whitman's murders of the I and the you throughout this text, or throughout his text, gives voice to the egalitarian idea that the one adding themselves and indeed already part of the voices of the many. Juxtaposed with the paper grass and the open back cover flap, the clamshell is another textured white rectangular highlighted by the pale green trim. Readers are immediately drawn to the large 200 below the orange tab that signifies Whitman's 200th birthday. The area above the orange tab is quoting another poem, Song of Myself, which has been part of Leaves of Grass since the first edition. The quote reads, "A child said, 'What is the grass?' Fetching it to me with his hands full. How can I answer the child? I don't know what it is any more than he." Emerson's integration of the paper structure in the quotation then takes initial extended compilation of the grass that follows this line in Whitman's poem, like the innumerable individual lives of the catalog after catalog of the poem figured as the grass, what Folker calls Whitman's quasi-epic list. And the paper blades, and the variety in the combined whole of the book is artist reputation, Whitman's central metaphor. And like the speakers that song in the open road or Song of Myself, Emerson's cyclic unions of one and many not only ask us to know others and to know ourselves, but to both trust in and recognize the truth that to know others is to know yourself, and to know yourself as to know others. Whitman, unsure of how or when these vital themes of his poetry will be received, is nonetheless optimistic that such recognition is forthcoming, calling out to anyone who will listen when he writes, "A child said, 'What is the grass?' Fetching it to me with full hands, how could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he." This is the wisdom of a person who has traveled far on the open road and through this book, and realizes that he has so much more to learn and travel to explore outside and inside the pages of a book. This slide right here is the horizontal, see the different blades there, the different colors and how it cycles through and how it almost somewhat matches up with the top books. The prompting this ignorance and the call to continue this journey, like the poem's Emerson quotes, then the paper and the grass highlights the beauty of what is really there, including the embrace of the unknown. The you for whom the speaker of Song of Myself waits in perpetuity. In this way, Whitman lines, which at first seemed to be like bookends instead of a frame, opening and interpreting Emerson's artist book. And so the last slide that I have for you today is the works cited from my paper.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you.
So The Hermaphrodite, written and disposed of by Julia Ward Howe and then resurrected in 2004 for posthumous publication, is an incomplete attempt at a novel filled with gaps that splice through the journey of its protagonist, Lawrence. He, him are the dominant pronoun used throughout the work, and so those are the pronouns I will be using in this presentation. Lawrence, a hermaphrodite, believes himself unlovable due to his unintentional rupture of the gender binary, keeping even his closest confidants always at an arm's distance. It is the reader then who is able to burrow closest into Lawrence's psyche, witnessing the dysphoric turmoil of an almost man as he craves, then rejects romantic desire and forms half-hearted relationships with those drawn into his, quote, otherworldliness. Lawrence is thus positioned simultaneously as an object of great desire and great disgust, never quite settling into a fixed role as one or the other. Rather, desire and disgust mesh and entwine themselves within Lawrence's perception of self, creating a dynamic and perhaps early literary view of dysphoric existence, a tightrope walk across the gender binary that inevitably ends in a full throttle crash towards the ground. As such, I'm interested in how the gaps in Howe's work, beginning with the absence of the novel's first page, serve to function as narrative mirrors to Lawrence's complicated gendered existence, amplifying the amorphous nature of Lawrence's gendered embodiment, while complementing and further mirroring his manhood's inherent instability. This instability is perhaps best viewed in the novel's final moment when Lawrence succumbs to a feverish demise at the same time he is able to articulate the experience of dying, and then the feeling of death itself. The manuscript's unfinished status thus acts in service to what trans scholar T. Garner refers to as a radical trans-becoming, a process where Lawrence's body is, quote, marked, becoming strange or other, always situated in opposition to the original body, which is uncritically associated with being natural, and thereby opens up the possibility of post-human ontology, end quote. The gaps in Howe's work simultaneously function to literalize Lawrence's gendered agony in life and usher in his freedom in death. The reader's introduction to Lawrence begins in medias res on account of the novel's missing first page. But rather than view the first page as missing, one could argue that its absence is the first introduction to Lawrence's dysphoric embodiment that the reader experiences. Drawing on what scholar Scott Rodman refers to as queer fictions of the past, Lawrence, caught mid-speech in these opening moments, operates in relation to, quote, partial perspectives, both incomplete and value-laden, telling us something but not everything about the world, and doing so at a certain cost. The incompleteness of this beginning serves as an important rupture. Already the text refuses to situate the reader comfortably in any temporal or spatial relation. Like Lawrence, we are caught in a state of both presence and disembodiment. what one might call a dysphoric kind of readership. We enter Lawrence's speech midway through, quote, ellipses, ration on the part of my parents, it was resolved to invest me with the dignity and insignia of manhood, which would at least permit me to choose my own terms in associating with the world, and secure to me an independence of position more desirable for one who could never hope to become the half of another. I was baptized, therefore, with a masculine name, destined to a masculine profession, and sent to a boarding school for boys, that I might become robust and manly, and happily learn to seem that which I could never be. Here we are suspended immediately in Lawrence's dysphoric reckoning with his gender, and his articulation of maleness not as something that is inherent, but something that is stepped into to accommodate both his parents and a social position that is, quote, most desirable for one who could never hope to become the half of another. The missing first page situates Lawrence's perspective as inherently partial. He arrives to us on the page as a fragment, reiterating his position of hopelessness on the subject of future intimate encounters. This immediately fragmented personhood destabilizes any concrete view of Lawrence's person. Because he finds himself trapped within the confines of gendered expectations and seeks to fulfill a role within those confines, the reader does not come to know Lawrence as separate from these constructs. He positions himself in his speech as both entwined in the gender binary and stranded from it. As such, he operates in two seemingly oppositional spaces, one consumed by constructs of maleness and the other situated in a more nebulous zone, where language for his own body lacks the precision to accurately name itself away from binary constraints. The hole left by the first page's absence illuminates this tension between the unspoken disruptive skin and the ill-fitting yet materially beneficial skin that is crafted out of social necessity, shrouded in metonymic meaning that others will surely recognize as the dignity and insignia of manhood. But if the absence of that first page comes to illuminate Lawrence's entrapment within the confines of the gender binary, it might also provide evidence of Lawrence's subsequent escape from the expectations placed upon him and framed within his name. Lawrence, in his opening words, appears to acknowledge his manhood's performative dressings. He willingly steps into his role as man, which simultaneously reveals his ability to step out of it as well. In this sense, the hole where we lose Lawrence's first articulations becomes a space for manifold possibilities of embodiment. In the unseen space of the absent page, Lawrence does not perform in service to the text's strict gender politics or a readerly gaze that bears witness to his dysphoric plight. Rather, the first page's invisibility can be read as a space and a beacon of potential liberation for Lawrence's gender expression, a point removed from temporal or spatial constraints where the non-binary subject is free to explore, an embodiment that trans scholar and poet Joy Layden refers to as, quote, the complex, unstable, contradicting relations between body and soul, social self and psyche. Here, Lawrence's varied modes of gendered embodiment become both self-made and redacted, both hidden and intimately felt. It is within this unstable surface that Lawrence is able to find solace. Though perpetually drifting through states of yearning and solitude, Lawrence's brief unknowability and the gaps of Howe's text offer places to imagine his freedom. It is there in that space where he is removed entirely from the book object, but where the space is known by the reader via the text's own acknowledgement of its partial construction, where Lawrence becomes perhaps most visible, most clearly drawn. The gaps in Howe's novel help illuminate other kinds of gaps in the text, other absences that in their invisibility remain present and deeply felt, thus warranting further consideration. One such gap is in the absence of Lawrence's genitals on the page. Neither described or lingered on, Lawrence's genitals nonetheless act as a phantom catalyst for other conflicts, such as Lawrence's uninvested courtship of widow Emma Von P., the object of every man's desire in Lawrence's academic neighborhood, but who seems to have eyes only for Lawrence. The chapters of their courtship further reveal the constructions of Lawrence's manhood, as he seems less interested in pursuing a romance with Emma than he is with beating the other male suitors in a poetry writing competition to win her affections. In fact, the tension born from Lawrence's talent as a writer and the subsequent envy of Wilhelm, another of Emma's suitors, threatens to overshadow the chemistry between Lawrence and Emma entirely. In a comically constructed scene that explores the seemingly mythical powers of Lawrence's in-between body, Emma, succumbing to her feelings for Lawrence to an extreme degree, barges into his room and says, I am here alone in your room, in your power at dead of night. You cannot misinterpret this. It must convince you that I love you better than life, better than honor, better than my own soul and God. Give me but this one night, but this 1 hour. Do you ask where I shall be tomorrow? I can die tomorrow. I shall have been happy. Emma's desperation and hunger for Lawrence's affection speaks to Lawrence's alluring nature, one he refuses to act upon given the state of his flesh. But in a humorous moment of foreshadowing, Emma states herself willing to die for Lawrence's attention, thus sealing her fate once Lawrence discloses himself as a hermaphrodite to her. It's important here to note that in the scene, Lawrence's genitals are never described. They don't need to be. Their invisible power is enough for Emma to name him monster, an act that carries with it a current contemporary resonance. It is not the genitals themselves, but the mere suggestion of them, and the subsequent imagining of their presumably disruptive image that becomes too much for the thinker to bear. In this way, Emma fills in the gap of Lawrence's body with an image entirely her own, then recoils against her own creation. This early example of trans panic, a prolepsis we might call it, builds upon her noticing Lawrence's bearded lip and earnest brow, the fallen shoulders, the slender neck, and the rounded bosom. Here, Emma comes to view pieces of her own framework. Lawrence's masculine coded features blend with what Emma considers feminine as she is unable to reconcile the seemingly opposed gendered markers fitting snugly within the same body. Lawrence here becomes a doubled and contradictory presence, at once the object of her fierce affection and a monster, something utterly inhumane. Furthermore, the absence of Lawrence's genitals subverts the typical gaze one might come to expect in the viewing of a gender variant other. Instead, it's the entirety of Lawrence's bodily framework that draws in and spits out his suitors. This curse of perpetual distancing ensures that Lawrence remains a cavity within his own romantic pursuits, at once written and redacted, human then not, wanted and then violently refused. In a transpoetic fashion, he is made to navigate the center of these many oppositional poles, never permanently fixed towards either direction and thus doomed to remain eternally unsettled. It is in this state of emotional entrapment that Lawrence comes to embody scholar Elizabeth Grosh's definition of the freak, a subject that, quote, is neither unusually gifted nor unusually disadvantaged. He or she is not the object of simple admiration or pity, but is a being who is considered simultaneously and compulsively fascinating and repulsive, enticing and sickening. But rather than remaining the sole freak in Howe's text, Lawrence's presence seems to expand Grosh's definition to encompass Lawrence's suitors via the freakish gaze he casts upon them. For these suitors also shift from subjects of fascination to subjects of repulsion in the eyes of Lawrence, due to their violently carnal reactions to him, of which he has no control, and in their sudden loss of control in regards to their own bodies and temperaments. It is ultimately through Lawrence's reflective and returning gaze that freakdom becomes marked upon the surfaces of those who look upon him with both repulsion and fervor. In their looking, they too become observably freakish subjects, both to Lawrence and to us. Indeed, while Emma's epiphany solidifies Lawrence's status as monster due to her dramatic bodily reaction a few sentences later, she too becomes untethered from her flesh and humanity in the eyes of Lawrence, who regards her no longer as a woman to whom he shows affection, but as a genderless mass of hysterical flesh. Upon observing his curious mix of feminine and masculine features, Emma elicits, quote, a shriek, fearful to hear and thrice fearful to give, followed by another, and a maniacally foaming and writhing on the floor at my feet. In a strange moment of bodily transference, Emma becomes decentered within her own uncontrollable flesh, a maniac in the face of Lawrence's monster. But while Lawrence is doomed to carry his flesh further into the novel, Emma succumbs fully to her body's rebellion, effectively degendered and dehumanized beneath the specter of Lawrence's freakishness. While other gaps exist in the text, such as the collection of missing pages which would have attempted to bridge Lawrence's life in Germany to his arrival in Rome, my aim here is to instead attend primarily to the narrative gap that comes to encompass Lawrence's death in a way that refuses finality. And so it is here in the strange poetry of Lawrence's body that I want to briefly bring in a discussion of the transpoetic formulated by scholars Susan Stryker, Paisley Carra, and Melissa Jean Moore, where the open form trans M- allows for a method of keeping, quote, the difference between the implied nominalism of trans and the explicit relationality of trans M-, which remains open-ended and resists the premature foreclosure by attachment of any single suffix, end quote. In other words, the openness of trans M- articulates a kind of multifarious and fluid imagining of Lawrence's sex and gendered embodiment. To describe Lawrence as trans M- as opposed to transgender or intersex is an attempt to situate Lawrence as outside the realm of language available both to him and to his observers. This is further validated in Lawrence's ability to document his own death from his position on the medical table. He is at once able to transcribe the conversations about his body without being able to articulate or being able to participate in them. His gaze remains ever present at the same time it appears inactive. Garner's theory of trans-becoming, once again, is useful to note here, as Lawrence's body becomes marked in death by a different kind of otherness, not gendered, but straddling the line between human and not. Is the dead body still human? Is a corpse still capable of humanity? Lawrence's narration offers no easy answers to these questions, but Garner's theory helps to reposition Lawrence not necessarily against humanity, but beyond it, in a post-human realm where gendered language is suddenly unnecessary. Lawrence's process of becoming reimagines gender transition as a transition between life and death, veering the concept away from the common image of a gender non-conforming subject reconstructing themselves with the help of surgeons or psychiatrists. In Lawrence's death state, transitioning becomes a wholly imagined process, announcing an agency that exists outside the realm of biology. This post-human ontology, as Garner calls it, is further amplified by the novel's last line, which signals both an end and a continuation of Lawrence's story. Another gap in Howe's text emerges here in the line, quote, "he knelt for, comma," end quote, an incomplete sentence and an incomplete end. But rather than viewing this fragment as a kind of narrative finality, Lawrence's unfinished voice beyond death might instead signal further possibilities of trans and dash embodiment, where the self is expressed continuously and malleably across temporal and spatial zones. Without the punctuation mark, which announces a complete end stop, Lawrence's story dissolves into the page's white space, thus mirroring his state of being throughout the whole novel, which, even in death, remains stranded from the rest of humanity, perpetually out of reach. The unclosed ending thus serves as a doorway for Lawrence to enter into a space where no one, not even the reader, can follow him. Julia Ward Howe's The Hermaphrodite offers an unruly character study where gender nonconformity in all its complex, varied forms is evident in the story itself and in the novel's destabilized structure on account of its many missing parts. However, these missing components serve to illuminate and inform the struggles that Lawrence experiences as he searches for love and wrestles with the constraints of his gender presentations. Ultimately, it is in the manuscript's splintered structure that Lawrence is able to articulate the full breadth of his personhood. In the end, perhaps this gaping form is the best way to experience the text about dysphoria. It seems fitting then that the unwritten pages converge with the pages written, and that Lawrence remains to us in the end wholly and complete. Thank you.
All right, our fourth speaker is David Anthony of Southern Illinois University. His paper is titled Molineux, Charlottesville, and the Jew. David Anthony is professor and director of the School of Literature, Writing, and Digital Humanities at SIU Carbondale. His paper stems from his book, Sensationalism in the Jew and Antebellum American Literature, forthcoming in August from Oxford University Press.
Okay, I want to start by saying that this paper is drawn from the afterword of the book that Susan just mentioned, Sensationalism in the Jew and Antebellum American Literature. As the title suggests, I'm looking at the way sensational literature of the sort produced by writers like George Lepard and Ned Buntline, as well as quasi-sensational work by Hawthorne, Whitman, and Poe, often deployed the Jew as a means of negotiating a felt sense of anxiety over a shift away from an orderly world based on church and monarchy and toward a more unstable post-Enlightenment world centered around capitalism. The moment in Lepard's best-selling novel from 1845, The Quaker City, when the Jewish dwarf, quote unquote, Gabriel von Gelt, clutches a chest of gold to his chest and whispers, "Begot, I smelch the gold already," is representative. Or if you haven't read The Quaker City, which is fine, consider an 1833 political cartoon by T.W. Whitley entitled "The People Putting Responsibility to the Test," and this is the image that's up here, which I think of as an extra literary text that participates in the general discourse of literary sensationalism. The topic of this image is the chaotic response to Jackson's controversial decision in late 1833 to withdraw federal funds from the U.S. Bank and redistribute them to his pet state banks. In the background, we see farmers and laborers rioting, this while Jackson flees stage right and the statue of justice is pulled down. But it's the foreground of the image that captures our attention. Here we see a Jewish broker named Levi clutching a sack of bullion and engaging in a financial transaction with a sailor. I say, Moses, give us some ballast for this here bit of rag, the sailor says. Levi responds as follows. Mein Gott, that is the pet banks, I'll give you $1 for the 10. Deploying the stereotype of the Jew as greedy and opportunistic, the cartoon implies it is the Jew who has stolen the nation's missing gold bullion, and with it, America's fiscal security. But a more abstract reading is that the Jew embodies the very chaos we see behind it. He is the effigy of panic and instability, not just financial panic, but social and moral panic writ large. This effort to offset the anxiety of disorder via anti-Semitic displacement is the strategy Zygmunt Bauman addresses with particular nuance. The great fear of modern life is that of underdetermination, unclarity, uncertainty. In other words, of ambivalence, he writes. And so the temptation is to de-ambivalentize the ambivalence by condensing or focusing it onto one obvious and tangible object, and then burn ambivalence down in this effigy. For Bauman, this effigy is the Jew. I would argue that much the same is true for antebellum sensationalism. Over and over in these narratives, the boundaries demarcating an orderly hierarchical world proves permeable and unstable. And again, the figure who embodies this free-for-all world is the Jew. But why study the antebellum Jew now? One answer was offered in the events in Charlottesville, Virginia on August 11th and 12th of 2017. This was when approximately 600 marchers descended on the town for a Unite the Right rally, quote unquote. And this is an image you guys are probably somewhat familiar. Ostensibly a demonstration against the proposed removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee from what was then called Lee Park, the event became an opportunity for a range of groups, white nationalist, neo-Confederate, neo-Nazi, and more, to advocate for white supremacy. But while in keeping with their desire to champion Lee and the Confederacy, the marchers certainly advocated anti-Black racism, the mobs also gave full throttle expression to anti-Semitism. This particular round of hate speech actually began to take shape on August 11th, 2017, when white supremacist Richard Spencer led a nighttime rally to protest the city's plan to remove Lee's statue. The event drew over 100 protesters to the UVA campus, many of whom took up the chants "Blood and Soil" and "Jews will not replace us." Similar tactics were employed at the larger rally the next day, where demonstrators marched with tiki torches, displayed swastikas on banners, brandished semi-automatic rifles outside a local synagogue, and aired the same "Jews will not replace us" slogan. To many, this eruption of anti-Semitism was surprising, even strange. Why target Jews at a rally focused on the Confederacy? But in fact, there are many links between nostalgia for the Confederacy and anti-Semitism of the sort reflected in the chant, "Jews will not replace us." Indeed, the various hate groups converging in Charlottesville saw in the Jews something quite similar to that imagined in the Quaker City, and in the lithograph I showed you, the people putting responsibility to the test. Simply put, the Jew was an imagined effigy for their collective fear about an ambivalent, topsy-turvy world, one in which the unraveling of stable hierarchies of class and race and gender have left white Christian men in a nervous state of social and economic uncertainty. The chant of "Jews will not replace us" speaks directly to this anxiety. As critics have explained, the phrase quite purposefully references white replacement theory. This is the belief that non-white people or foreigners will overtake the U.S. via immigration, reproduction, and the seizure of political power via access to the ballot box. The phrase also reflects the belief that this trend is being funded and encouraged by wealthy Jews like George Soros, whose vision of a globalist liberal democracy is perceived as inherently threatening to the sorts of white men who participated in the Charlottesville rally. And I popped in here, this is a kind of standard cartoon you can see these days of George Soros, but this was from 2017 as Puppet Master. And this is a more recent image. This is part of another essay I'm working on the kind of circulation of this happy merchant meme that shows up a lot on kind of internet, kind of dark internet sites. And here he is as Puppet Master. This is more recent, maybe 2020, something like that. Replacement theory helps us see the many links between the Jew as imagined in recent outbreaks of political violence, not only Charlottesville, but also the January 6th insurrection, the murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and so on, and the antebellum figure terming the sensational Jew. In both periods, the Jew is perceived as the figure of social and political instability. But to emphasize and further unpack this parallel, I want to pause over an antebellum text famous for its depiction of political upheaval. And that's Nathaniel Hawthorne's well-known short story about early 18th century colonial rebellion, My Kinsman Major Molineux. And that's 1832 is the exact date. As Hawthorne's narrator explains, the narrative revolves around tensions between British colonial government in Boston and the local inhabitants. Here is the opening. After the kings of Great Britain had assumed the right of appointing the colonial governors, the people looked with most jealous scrutiny to the exercise of power which did not emanate from themselves. In what ensues, we see the naive protagonist Robin arrive to the city via ferry and seek out his kinsman, the eponymous Major Molineux. Robin's plan is to receive preferment from Molineux and thus establish himself in a career away from home. But despite his best efforts, Robin is unable to locate his relative until story's end. Instead, he wanders the mysterious streets of the city, consistently rebuffed whenever he inquires as to the whereabouts of Molineux. And this, we finally learn, is because Major Molineux has been deposed from his position in a violent uprising. In a late and melodramatic nighttime scene, replete with torchlight, Robin finally sees what everyone else in town seems to have known all along, that his kinsman has been tarred and feathered. Right before Robin's eye was an uncovered cart, we're told. There the torches blazed brightest, and there in tar and feather dignity sat his kinsman, Major Molineux. The setting is uncannily similar to the nighttime march in Charlottesville. This similarity is due in part to the quasi-Gothic but also chaotic setting. But the parallel also has to do with the mysterious man Robin encounters at various points in the story, first holding whispered conversation at a local inn, and then in muffled cloak on the street, when he tells Robin to keep watch for the imminent arrival of his kinsman. Described as having an unprecedented physiognomy, the man has a forehead with a double prominence, a broad hooked nose, shaggy eyebrows, fiery eyes, and a twofold facial expression. Certainly, as critics have suggested, the man symbolizes a split between self-governance and British rule. He's also, though, a figure of otherness that looks very much like the stereotypical Jew of this period. As Sandra Gilman notes, the broad hooked nose described in this passage, quote unquote, is a signature for a threatening form of Jewishness. And to be sure, Hawthorne's story obsesses over this feature as it does over physiology in general. The nose came boldly forth in an irregular curve, he writes, and its bridge was of more than a finger's breadth. Hawthorne isn't the only antebellum writer to rely on this physiological trope. In Poe's 1839 The Fall of the House of Usher, we're told that Roderick Usher has a nose of a delicate Hebrew model, quote unquote. In Emerson Bennett's novel The Artist's Bride, the scheming Jew Isaac Jacobs is described as having both an aquiline nose and a hawk-bill nose. And there are other texts I could list. Or, to shift over to the visual, consider Edward Clay's 1838 political cartoon, How to Make the Mayor/Mayor Go. The image satirizes the suspected corruption in New York City, the New York City mayoral race of that year, by invoking a stereotyped image of a Jew replete with an excessively large and hooked nose and broken English. According to Clay, political collusion and Jewishness go hand in hand. The broader implication is that the Jew is the figure onto whom the ambivalent messiness and dishonesty of American politics is displaced. In Hawthorne's story, unlike in Poe, Bennett, or Clay, Jewishness remains implied, or perhaps even unconscious. The man looks and acts like the stereotype of the sensational Jew, but he isn't labeled as one by Hawthorne. We might go so far as to call the Jewishness we see here a phantom presence, one not unlike the Jewish non-presence in Charlottesville. Note, though, that Hawthorne's later writing, especially his private notebooks, reflects a fairly unchecked form of anti-Semitism. And in a longer version of the paper, I could quote all kinds of crazy passages. Here in this 1832 story, we're presented with a related but different form of anti-Semitism. Here we see that Robin, like the Charlottesville marchers, discovers in the ghostly quality of Jewishness the embodiment of his felt anxiety about social upheaval. For one thing, the mysterious man is revealed to be the leader of the uprising. We sense this first when Robin sees him in whispered conversation with a group of ill-dressed associates. We see this also in the sneering glance the man levels at Robin. He is clearly an untrustworthy schemer. But the man's role as dangerous revolutionary is most fully visible when Robin sees that the man is riding a horse at the head of the tar and feather procession. Suddenly we realize that the Jew's twofold face is the very image of the ambivalent world spilling over into the streets and into Robin's rapidly changing life. May not a man have several voices as well as two complexions? The seemingly kind gentleman asked Robin. The question is both mocking and appropriate. This is the state of the new world Robin has entered, one where the old hierarchies are giving way to the disorder and ambivalence of liberal democracy. Robin's unspoken answer is that he preferred it otherwise. But Robin is learning during his evening of ambiguity, quote unquote, that the stable sense of kinship relations he relied upon as a youth at home isn't applicable to the more urban and indeed more cosmopolitan world. In Boston, the confession of an empty pocket, quote unquote, actually outweighs the name of his kinsman, Major Molineux, quote unquote. Relatedly, as he wanders the quasi-Gothic streets in search of Molineux, Robin twice encounters groups of men who don't speak English. Instead, they, quote, utter a few words in some language of which Robin knew nothing, end quote. Certainly, it's the encounter with Molineux that is the chief horror of the night for Robin. But the foundation for Robin's hysterical reaction to his kinsman's humiliation, his laughter, is prepared by his efforts to understand a newly modern, perhaps even global world in which the old rules don't apply. And again, that global world is represented by the mysterious man who, it seems to me, is a Jew, or rather a sensational Jew, an all but name. Indeed, it's important to emphasize that while Robin ends up realizing that the mysterious man is helping to depose a figure of British rule, he isn't revealed as a revolutionary hero. And this is because, as Paul Downs suggests, democracy is itself viewed with ambivalence in the story. As Downs puts it, quote, Hawthorne's story seems to suggest that the city of the dead, the city of mob violence and night terrors, is also our America, our democracy, our modernity, end quote. What we see then is a Gothic narrative that responds to desacralization and the pretensions of rationalism by staging forces that cannot be accounted for by the daylight self. Hence Robin's confusion as he wanders the mysterious nightmare world of Boston's streets. He now roamed desperately, we're told, and at random through the town, almost ready to believe that a spell was on him. The city streets are similar to the labyrinthine interior of a Gothic setting like Monk Hall in the Quaker City. The difference is that in Hawthorne's story, no clear distinction between good and evil emerges. Instead, we're left only with the uncomfortable sense that revolutionary fervor may in fact be the chief evil of the story. This is why it's so telling that the menacing leader of the mob that tars and feathers Molineux is depicted as a Jew. One might say that this revolutionary character could only be a Jew, just as the hate groups in Charlottesville could only have chosen the Jew as the ghostly image of their fears and frustrations. Then as now, it is the Jew who best performs the cultural work of ambivalence in America. He is the lurking, frightening figure of the moment when social categories of national affiliation, class, race, gender, sexuality, and more change shape and then keep on changing over and over into an uncertain future.
Thank you.
what Mel, you know what Memphis? Ishmael. The whiteness of the whale is supposed to be disturbing. Dumb language, where essentially it can mean anything, where it projects whatever you want it to mean on it, or it can kind of can't move before it can't move. You can find any meaning in it, and therefore you can find no meaning in it. And that chapter is one reason for the response. So the point being, as I interpret it, is Ahab sort of comes into the general rage of all of his crew, and he encourages them to project that onto the figure. So he's kind of a Murray-ish sort of religious in that respect. He's encouraging people to sort of do their own thematic perception. But as to why Ahab himself gets people project their own sort of stuff onto, I don't know. That's like that.
I could indulge the period has lots of figures of curiosity, instability, and outsiderness. The figures of spatial existence. What is specific about this figure? Is that figure doing something different from those others? Is it a continuum?
What I'm talking about here is a bit of a variation or a kind of a deviation, sorry, from the main focus of what I place in my book, which is the connection to narratives about and anxieties about money. And the Jew is kind of obsessively offered up as the figure through whom to kind of project, let's say, project anxieties about capitalism. And some of that comes up in Molineux. It's obviously a sort of more political revolution. But that is the consistent kind of thread that makes narratives about the Jew kind of unique. And then by extension, various other kind of selfish desire, self-possession, etc. But always under the kind of sign of figuring out what this thing, capitalism, is. And it's sort of, obviously that has a long history, right? And it just gets kind of borrowed in America. Just repeatedly the stories that I look at, they're all
like the plantation, one of the prior. So we have 3 publications after the book.
right. So even, weirdly, I found a lot of plantation novels that, anti-Tom plantation novels, or a cluster of them, in which there's a consistent figure of the Jewish predator who shows up. And on the one hand, he just, at first glance, he looks like, it's northern capitalism. But in some ways, it's actually more about, I think, the South kind of negotiating its own relationship to its own economy. It wants to believe that it has a feudal economy. It isn't capitalism, but of course, as some really great histories have really helped us understand in detailed ways. Slavery is capitalist through and through, right? And capitalism in many ways grew up out of the credit that was enabled through slavery. And so that's the South imagining its own relationship to money. And so I would say even I would go so far as to say that it's a sort of primal, the figure of the Jew, which is so stereotypically represented over and over again in the 19th century, is sort of kind of U.S. primalcy, or it sees its own origins under capitalism, but in kind of in an embarrassed glimpse of our origins that we're kind of don't want to see, but it's our relationship to desire, messiness of desire in this new kind of predator.
You sneak in one last. Okay, a little easier than what is
Question for Spence. I was struck by the
fact that this was, I'd never heard of this novel that Julie worked on. The only thing I'd known about Howe is that the battle hymn and you know, the Mother's Day proclamation. And I'm wondering if you have a sense as to what Howe felt this novel, what impact this novel might make. You seem to be somebody who had a good sense of, or at least an outward good sense of political effects, the different sort of literary projects you had.
Yeah. Had a this kind of merit, and I think with this topic that becomes ultimately abandoned, but was really sort of thing where feeling like after sort of this figure that like did not very sort of yes, kind of politically active, like sort of the Hermaphrodite figure is sort of like grapple and sort of interrogate kind of constraints related to gender, without sort of having to kind of yeah, it allows for like a slippage between sort of like masculine and feminine like considerations that I think she felt satisfied with. And so I think the Hermaphrodite because it is a novel about kind of for like dissatisfaction with kind of like objective labels or boxes or and feeling and sort of like a hopeless novel in that sense. Feel like the only way out of this experience is sort of like that where hopefully we are still able to sort of articulate ourselves. Yeah, so maybe.
How many words?
The novel?
Yeah.
It's like the sort of pages that we have of the different days of Wednesday. Yeah, like a pretty short sort of novel that like depending on sort of like how many minutes the pages are.
Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you for bearing with this quixotic Zoom adventure. Emma and Amy, appreciate it. Thank you so much. And American Afterlives 2024, book it. All right. Bye, Emma. Bye, Amy.